Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at HTML forms. This video is part of a larger series of videos focusing on HTML, CSS, client, and server-side scripting. And specifically in this video, we are going to modify an earlier example where we used the get method to call a resource on a web server. Now, if you have not yet watched that video, I encourage you to go back and watch that video. I'm trying to break some of this content up into smaller videos so that you can reference them individually later on. But rather than go through this entire example one more time, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to modify the files from the previous example. In other words, the one where we created the form and simply called using the get method the resource on the server. And so just as a quick reminder, you can see there is my collect_03.html. Your name might be different on this, but when I click submit, basically the named parameters on the form get passed to the server using the name and value pair combination in the query parameters. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to see what happens when we change the behavior or the method from get to post. And so what we're going to do is we're simply going to go to our file system, and the easiest way is, rather than to recreate it from scratch, is to simply make a copy of our collect_03, and we're going to rename it collect_04, and we're going to do the same thing with our process_03.php, and we're going to rename this one process_04.php. Now, what we'll do is we'll simply pull these two files up in Visual Studio, and we're going to make a few changes. Starting with the collect_04.html, of course, don't forget to change your title so that it matches. As a matter of fact, probably a nice thing to do is to change this to post. And the file that we're going to reference, in other words, the action, is going to be our process_04.php, and the method is going to be post. Now, the whole goal with this video is to show the differences between the get and the post, and I can explain it to you before we actually run these examples, or we can just simply see the difference and it will hopefully make a little more sense to you. Likewise, what we want to do is we can come over here to our process_04.php, and we'll specify which array we're pulling the information out of by just simply changing from the get to the post. And again, if you followed along a little bit with the PHP tutorial, you'll know that the get and the post are basically special global variables in PHP that allow for you to pull information from a query. Now, at this point, we should be set to go ahead and save the PHP and the HTML. And this assumes that you've already got your Apache web server up and running. And if you recall from the earlier video, clicking on the collect_04.html won't do what we need it to do. In other words, just double clicking on the file pulls it up on the file system. And instead, what we want to do is we want to access it from the web server. So in this case, 127.0.1/collect_04.html. And at this point, the same form pops up. However, the difference is it's being served off of our web server. And what we'd like to do is, again, just simply populate the first name and the email address. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the submit button. And you'll notice that we get the same results that we did when we had our get method. The difference being, if you notice that the URL is different. In other words, it doesn't have the query parameters like the collect_03. And again, I'm going to submit this example one more time, just so you can see the difference. There is the question mark followed by the name and value pairs. So how exactly is the information getting to the web server? And specifically, how is the same information getting to the web server? I think you can guess how it's being parsed differently on the web server by virtue of the get and post global variables. But to answer that question, we actually need to pull up some additional tools. And depending on which browser you are using, you should be able to find the developer tools. In Chrome, you'll see it under More Tools, Developer Tools. And what we can do is we can actually see what is being passed between the client, in other words, your web browser, and your server, in this case, Apache. In order to do that, I'm simply going to go back to the original collect_04.html, and I'm going to look at the network resources and select submit, and you'll see that you can now see where that call was made, or rather you can see the details of that call to your web server, as well as the response. Status 200 means that it was in fact successful. And by simply clicking, whoops, did not mean to double click. Apologies there. Let's try that one more time. By clicking on process_04, you can see a lot of information, including the payload, preview, the response, and so on from your web server. And what we're interested in is the headers and the payload. And specifically, you can see there is the request method specifying post to that particular resource. The address, it says remote address. In this case, it's actually hosted on our local computer, but effectively it wouldn't matter. And you can see, for instance, the content type, what type of server, the PHP version, and so on. You've got actually quite a lot of information that you have here, including the operating system, what type of browser, a lot of additional information. And you'll notice that over here under the payload, under the form data, is the first name and the email address. And again, what's happening is that information is being sent slightly different than it was with the GET. In the GET, it was being passed in the URL itself. If you notice, we could technically type this information in. In other words, if I wanted to, I could simply copy and paste this URL into another tab, and I could change, for instance, the first name to something like perhaps George. And you can see that it would work just fine. Effectively, with the query string, you don't really have much of a reason to have a separate page. In other words, you could call it from any number of different agents. Now, you can do the same thing with the post and the form data. However, it's a little more complicated to build that form data. Fundamentally, both ways allow for you to pass information to your web server. The post is used to handle more secure transactions as well as more complicated data. It's a lot easier to pass a lot more information using a post than it is a GET. There are some additional differences between the two methods. However, the purpose behind this particular video is just so that you can see how changing the method in the form changes how the information gets from the first resource to your web server. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.